Tonight, beneath the vast roots of Yggdrasil, the air holds the weight of ages. Here, where the well of Ur lies still and deep, the three sisters of fate, Vergandi, and Skuld sit in the shadow of the world tree, weaving destinies into threads too fine for mortal eyes to follow. Their fingers move with a calm older than the gods themselves. Even Odin, the All-Father, comes here quietly, knowing the Norns do not answer to kings or crowns. In the threads they draw, some carry the lives of heroes who begged for more time, others the silence of gods awaiting the end they cannot prevent. Through their weaving, the prophecy of Ragnar comes softly, a storm gathering in the distance while the sisters work with the same steady patience as always. Yet not every thread is tied to doom. Some lives slip the loom entirely, unwritten and untouched, leaving behind mysteries even the gods cannot read. As the night deepens, the Norns continue their silent craft at once recording, shaping and withholding the stories of a world racing toward its fate. And so, the roots of Yggdrasil remain heavy with secrets, watered each dawn by hands that never tremble. But if we follow the threads upward past the cool hush of the well, through the tangle of roots where whispers travel like migrating birds, we begin to see how these silent sisters reach into every corner of myth. Their loom binds the fates of gods who defy them, heroes who plead for mercy, and even the coming storm of Ragnarok itself. One by one, the stories take shape on the warp and weft of destiny, waiting for us to lean closer to trace the pattern before the final knot is tied. Under the vast roots of Yggdrasil, the air stays cool and carries the faint scent of wet bark and old snow. Here, three sisters sit where the earth feels busy yet calm, weaving the fates of gods and men with patient precision. Ur keeps the past in order, winding each thread neatly as though history prefers tidy shelves. Vergandi handles the present, measuring each life to its necessary length, humming softly as she works. Skuld, keeper of what has not yet come, remains the quietest, shaping destinies that walk toward the loom in silence. Each day they draw water from a sacred well to nourish the roots, their schedule unchanging. 3 ladles at dawn, 3 when frost lifts from the moss, 3 at the edge of dusk. They mend bark with clay, note a leaning branch, a persistent beetle, a knot in the wood. Even the gods approach them carefully, Odin himself offering only a nod, knowing too well that destiny dislikes commentary. Beneath their hands, threads tighten, loosen, or vanish, carrying storms and promises, victories and betrayals into the tapestry of the cosmos. Follow the trickle of water from the well for a moment, because it helps to think about the surface rather than the depth. The well of Ur looks unbothered most days, with a thin gray sheen like wool left in winter light. But if you lean over without hurrying, you can see faint movements that are not fish and not wind. The old poet said the well holds all the wisdom of time, which is a heavy assignment for liquid, yet it seems content with it. Every drop that rises carries a taste of what has already happened, and the Norns are careful with it, not because it is flashy, but because it is the sort of water that stains if you spill it on the wrong future. Some say runes swim there like pale twigs, but the sisters insist they are not swimming at all. They are simply refusing to sink, which is a very rune-like attitude. The bucket rope creaks in a rhythm you could count if counting helped you rest, and you might notice the wood handle has been polished smooth by hands that never rush. If you listen long enough, you can hear the tiniest swirl, as if time were stirring itself with an invisible spoon. A lizard warms itself on a flat stone beside the rim and pretends to have deep thoughts about fate. A small spider stretches a line across a gap that is exactly spider-sized, which is the most responsible way to build. Someone will ask whether the water reflects your future if you stare a minute, and the polite answer is no. Not because reflection is impossible, but because the well is not interested in spoilers. Odin once asked for a sip, paying with one eye, which to modern ears sounds like a questionable transaction, but the receipt is stamped, and there are no returns. He did not gulp. He sipped like a person learning to appreciate unsweetened tea, and the taste turned into a lifetime of long walks where he looked at distant weather and understood too much about it. If you are still awake, which is not required, you may consider following also, or perhaps subscribing quietly to the way drops gather on the bucket, swim and fall in a pattern that is not quite random, like the scheduling of your notifications when you forget to mute them. In that soft pattern, the loom finds its pace, and a new length of thread lifts into the light. When gods wander close, the threads behave like obedient guests at an afternoon visit. Odin's line glides past, surprisingly thin for someone with so many titles, then thickens where it passes battles and bargains and poetry. You can almost see the constant tension he carries in his shoulders. The way a cloak hangs a little heavier because it knows the person wearing it read the last page first. Around him, the fates of the Aesir run in neat lanes, not because they are neat people, but because the loom dislikes tangles. Frigg has a thread that refuses to fray even when you rub it. Thor's line is heavy with a tendency to bounce if you set it down too fast. Freya's has a soft sheen that looks like it would smell of apples if smells could cross from story to cloth. The sisters adjust and nobody argues. There is a small legend that Loki's strand was once dyed a harmless straw color and keeps showing hints of red anyway, which is the sort of dye problem that makes you inspect your laundry instructions. The gods sometimes tried to negotiate with the Norns, offering amulets or awkward compliments, but the sisters excel at nodding kindly until the conversation loses its own motivation and goes to sit in a corner. Meanwhile, the threads of mortals arrive with a humility you can feel. A farmer who talks to his goats as if they were aldermen. A fisher with a lucky hook that has no idea it is lucky. A child who will grow into a poet who only writes in winter. Their lines pass beside the divine ones without fanfare, and the loom keeps time so gently that even jealousy grows drowsy and forgets to say anything sharp. Some heroes did try to bargain in more theatrical ways. One man threatened to change his fate with a sword, which is an interesting tool for a conversation about string. Another promised offerings so numerous that the well would need a second storage room, which is not how wells work. The threads did not tighten for them, and they did not loosen either. They simply continued with that earnest speed that feels like a long walk beside a calm river. A few lived just long enough to watch their prophecies arrive precisely on time, like shipments tracked by ravens, and they pronounced themselves satisfied in voices that were almost whispers. Even their tragedies, which were serious to them, looked from the loom like slightly darker wool. Not a call to alarm, only a reminder that dye lots vary. Before the last battle has even considered getting out of bed, the loom already holds the quiet murmurs that will lead to it, and the sisters treat those murmurs with the same respectful boredom they give to everything else. The threads of Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Loki lie coiled like links of rope ordered from a reputable catalog, each with a tag that reads, "Please do not pull unless prepared to accept consequences," printed in small, polite runes. When the Norns run their fingers over Fenrir's line, it hums faintly, less a growl than the sympathetic vibration of the world, remembering that mouths open and close. Jormungandr's strand is long enough to require a special basket, the kind used for seasonal decorations, and it smells faintly of salt and iron, which is to say, like the ocean's patient housekeeping. As these are woven, the sisters talk idly about twilight and the way ice makes a small crackle when it meets fire, which is less prophecy and more meteorology. Listeners sometimes feel a friendly weight pressing down, not of doom, but of inevitability, the comfortable kind that tells you the sun will set at its usual hour even if you don't set an alarm for it. Odin visits again, this time holding a question in one hand like a coin he knows he can't spend. Did the Norns tell him everything about the end, or did they let silence do the final editing? He suspects the latter because he understands that the crispest warnings are the ones nobody says out loud. In the great ash, a bough creaks like an old door that knows the house is safe. The ravens catch a draft of meaning, circle once, and then decide the meaning can handle itself. There's no scene of panic here, only the sensation of a ledger being balanced properly over a long, quiet afternoon. If you are timing your breaths, this is a comfortable place to let them match the rhythm of the bucket rope again, or to let them drift away from counting entirely, which is a skill the Norns appreciate in visitors. It is a soft secret of fate that not everything becomes thread, and the sisters keep a tidy drawer for the unwoven. Some wives, they agree, move gently alongside prophecy without ever getting tangled in it. Like people who live near a busy market and never need to shop there because their garden is prosperous. The sagas do not mention these lives very often, not out of malice, but because a story with no incident is a challenge for the bard, and yet those lives are as valid as any quietly blessed or quietly left to doze. The Norns file them as left untouched, a phrase that feels less like neglect and more like trust. In that drawer, there are moments as well as lives. Promises that did not need to be kept because nobody asked, arguments that would have started if someone had been less well rested. Journeys that seemed necessary in spring and then sensibly forgotten when summer turned out to be enough. There is also the matter of the secret never spoken, which everyone expects to be dazzling but behaves like a pebble, small, solid, and easy to carry. The loom knows what it is, and Odin suspects, and perhaps Yggdrasil itself murmurs about it through rings of age. But it does not become a scene, and it does not require music. If pressed, the sisters would say only that even fate deserves privacy in certain corners, the way a house keeps one drawer for odds and ends that are nobody's business, yet still help the house run. Think of a misplaced key that nevertheless keeps turning up exactly when you need it. Think of a word you choose not to say, and how that silence quietly repairs something you cannot name. The well grows still. The bucket rests on its stone like a cup set down after a long conversation, and the tree breathes in the old way it has always breathed. You can imagine the loom continuing long after this sentence, the shuttle sliding, the threads appearing with a patience that can afford to be boring because boring things are safe, and safe things are wonderfully sleepily durable. If you drift now, the sisters will keep ladling and nothing urgent will happen. If you remain, you will notice another tiny drop gather on the rim, hesitate as if considering a speech, then choose to fall without comment. And that choice, like most choices at the roots of the world, is exactly enough. You might not expect the most restful corner of Norse myth to involve a guard on endless duty, yet the quiet edge of the Rainbow Bridge is exactly where the world practices falling asleep. Heimdall stands at Himinbjerg with the patient posture of someone who has already counted every pebble in his path and found each one satisfactory. He is said to hear wool growing on sheep and grass sprouting from the ground, which is not exciting so much as reassuring, like discovering that the universe comes with a built-in librarian of sounds, filing them by volume and kind. His eyesight is arranged in a similar way, careful and thorough, as if dawn itself were an eye chart he reads every morning without squinting. He keeps still for long stretches, then adjusts the angle of his helmet by a thumb's width because the wind has shifted and he enjoys finishing small tasks properly. The sagas say he needs less sleep than a bird on a good day, which is a poetic way to confess that he hardly sleeps at all, but it never sounds like a complaint. He simply occupies the night with listening. If you pause here and listen with him, you begin to notice faint and oddly specific things. The slow thump of a wave forgetting what it was trying to say, the creak of a frost crystal turning over, the soft click of an ant deciding against heroism. It is the sort of soundscape that makes wakefulness feel optional. If you remain awake long enough to hear a few more, you're welcome to support this watch with a gentle gesture of approval somewhere on your screen. And if you drift away before that, Heimdall will take it as proof that the system is functioning and will add your sleep to his records, which exist only in his excellent memory. The bridge he watches, Bifrost, never imagines itself a highway. It prefers to think of its colors as patient lanes for dignified footsteps, resisting the urge to streak or sparkle. People like to call it a rainbow, and it is, but it is also something like a well-maintained stair that happens to be horizontal and elevated and made of light. Heimdall inspects it at unhurried intervals. The red should be sturdy. The gold needs to rest every few hours. The blue keeps forgetting where it put its edges and must be encouraged with a tilt of the head. He carries a cloth for polishing the portion that meets him in Bjerk's stone, a cloth that always smells faintly of warm iron and the last sunny day of autumn. On certain evenings, he steps onto the bridge and takes 3 precise paces, listening for the glimmering creak that means the light is cooling evenly. The Jallarhorn rests nearby. Wrapped in a protective cover, he knitted himself from undramatic wool, the color of early morning. He does not blow it. He likes to check the mouthpiece anyway, the way some people check the door lock, even when they know it is locked, and he manages this without introducing anxiety. "It is good to be sure," he once said to the door, and the door, being accustomed to this line of thinking, agreed by staying closed. He tidies small things. The bench by the lookout accumulates a polite drift of pollen in spring. He brushes it away with the back of his hand. A pair of crows tried to hold a meeting beneath the west arch. He suggested, very calmly, that meetings do better on a branch with a view. Even the bridge seems to breathe more evenly when he is around, as if relieved to be noticed in the proper, steady manner that prefers no applause. There is a rumor that Heimdall's teeth are made of gold, which sounds lavish until you realize gold is a very quiet metal. It does not clink much when you eat soft bread, and it reflects a little daylight into the mouth, which is not showy so much as well lit. He cleans them with a small brush carved from the bone of a fish that cooperated posthumously, and he does this at the same time every morning, because routine softens the hours the way water smooths a stone. His hearing being what it is, he performs the brushing at a pace that does not disturb the valley below, counting strokes as if they were tiny watchmen on patrol. The 9 mothers he came from, those sea giantesses with names like Whispering Waves, occasionally send him a ripple as greeting, and he returns it by standing a fraction straighter. Across the slope, sheep practice the noble art of standing, which they do well. If one of them coughs politely, Heimdall notices and nods. He knows the difference between a cough that means hay dust and a cough that means more hay is desired for reasons of principle. He can tell which grass slept poorly and which grass had a vivid dream about being due. Sometimes he hears a thought forming a long way off, and it is shaped like someone deciding to take a late walk. He does not interfere. He simply prepares a lane of the bridge to be particularly flat, in case that helps the walk feel sensible and safe. This habit of making things a shade easier than they were is the closest he gets to meddling. Visitors come rarely and slowly, which is the correct speed for visiting a watchman. When a traveler from Midgard appears at the foot of Bifrost with a puzzled expression and excellent manners, Heimdall meets them halfway and offers a small cup of something warm. The drink tastes like barley, sunlight, and a little patience. It carries no surprise, but restores the sort of energy used for nodding and saying, "ah," in the agreeable way. There is always a moment when the traveler looks down, notices how high they are, and thinks about concerns such as falling, tripping, or moving. Heimdall recommends the well-tested method of observing a fixed point at the horizon, then counting silently from 1 to 7 at a pace that would bore an impatient person. The count works. The visitor relaxes enough to notice that the bridge hums at the same frequency as a happy beehive. They ask tentative questions. Is the horn heavy? Only when full of wind, he replies. Do colors get tired? Only the red, he says, because red likes the last word. Do the gods always pass with such quiet sandals? Mostly he answers, though Thor's steps are less quiet and more sincere. The visitor asks whether the end of the world will be announced from this very bench. Heimdall says yes and gestures to the cushion he made for it out of woven reeds. If destiny must be proclaimed, it can at least respect lumbar support. He hands the traveler a small snack flatbread with a smear of goat cheese and a dab of lingonberry, which, he notes, pairs well with distant views. The traveler agrees. If you are still awake, consider agreeing too, not because the bread is present, but because agreement is a restful posture for the mind. If you are asleep, you are demonstrating advanced agreement, which Heimdall might record with quiet satisfaction. The house at Himmelberg is a tidy set of rooms whose windows are better at framing sky than keeping out gossip. Not that the sky gossips much. Inside, everything has a job and enjoys doing it. The hearth warms the stones as if paying an old debt. A shelf holds maps embroidered with threads that do not insist on accuracy, preferring to mark places by their personalities. A cove that thinks in circles, a hill that took a vow of stillness, a road that used to be a stream, and sometimes remembers how to curve. Heimdall keeps a logbook of uneventful days. It is thick. He does not write long entries. A line might read, "Breeze from east, carried a thought about mending a sleeve, concluded satisfactorily." Another, "Cloud in shape of spoon, maintained integrity for 27 counts." The margins contain little drawings of the moon with different expressions, none of them dramatic. The log is not for proof. It is for the pleasure of noticing. In a corner stands a modest chest where he stores wool covers for the horn, organized by season. He replaces the cover exactly when the light says the season has truly shifted, not when the calendar he keeps for the amusement of visitors suggests it should. If he has a vice, it is dusting the horn's cover more than necessary, not out of nervousness, but because the motion is soothing and produces a tiny cloud that looks like a visible sigh. Out on the steps, the bridge sends down a quiet echo that sounds like a very polite bell. Heimdall listens to it the way one listens to a friend tell a familiar story for the 6th time. The echo starts at the blue, walks through the green, and ends at the red with a little trilled flourish, which the red swears it does not practice, though everyone knows it does. The goats on the hillside chew in the same rhythm without being asked. They are cooperative beings, expert at participation that masquerades as indifference. Heimdall scratches one behind the left ear and says something kind about the weather. Using the conditional voice that farmers and guards favor, there will be rain if rain happens. The goats agree with their eyebrows. If you hold very still, you can feel the planet leaning slightly toward its next hour, which is the sort of movement that makes alarm clocks redundant. He hears far away a smith testing a hammer against a new anvil, the note ringing true and satisfied. He hears someone misplace a key in a room with only one table, and later find it directly beneath the one thing it could have been beneath, a development that provokes mild philosophy rather than blame. He hears a child decide to rename a favorite stick. He hears birds pronounce morning in 3 dialects. He files these things where they belong, which is to say, nowhere complicated. Scholars like to discuss whether Heimdall and Loki have a rivalry, the sort that might end in a loud courtroom. Heimdall is not sure what they mean by rivalry. He recognizes in Loki the same habit he hears in a stream that keeps trying new paths through a pebble bed. The trick is to measure patiently while the water invents opinions. He does not think of dispute. He thinks of flow rate. If Loki passes the bridge in an experimental mood, the colors adjust their hems, then resume being themselves. Heimdall prefers to keep the idea of conflict folded on a high shelf where it behaves. There is a line in the logbook that reads, "Unnecessary conversation avoided successfully." He is proud of that one. Somewhere a storyteller tells the version in which the two stand against each other as if arguing were a sport. Heimdall understands the need. A story likes edges, but memory likes gentler borders. The suggestion of a boundary, lightly penciled, with room for erasers and a spare afternoon. He tends those borders, not with rules, but with listening. It is difficult to misbehave loudly in the presence of someone who can hear the second thought before the first one finishes. As a result, much potential trouble stands around and shrugs itself back into regular life, much as thunderclouds do when a sturdy wind escorts them to the next valley. On moonless nights, the bridge glows only because it remembers how. Its light is the sort that would make a cat blink slowly and approve. Heimdall stands with his hand resting on the horn's covered curve. The cover is not ornamental. It keeps the horn's silence shiny. He watches the constellations drift like old friends switching seats. He keeps an eye on the small one shaped like a fishbone, mostly because the fishbone constellation likes to pretend it is a spear when nobody is watching. Sometimes a traveler from the dream of a fisherman wanders up, and Heimdall speaks to them in the way one speaks to a sleepwalker, compliment the sturdiness of their boots, suggest a direction that happens to be their bed, and leave them believing they chose it. Even his footsteps are considerate. He walks on the parts of the stone that appreciate being stepped on, leaving the shy slabs to contemplate dew. He can tell when the dew is thinking in a language the stone understands. He registers it as a very small silence, the kind you hear between the inhale and the exhale. Dawn is careful here. It arrives with a discipline the day respects. Heimdall has a set of movements he performs when the first pale stripe appears where the sky keeps its simple secrets. He stretches exactly enough to let his back acknowledge the existence of vertebrae. Then he faces toward Midgard and counts roofs who slept well. Most of them did. A few tried to worry about things without solutions. He hears them exhale and promises to remember nothing of it. He takes a small breakfast of porridge that has never met a rush. The porridge believes in staying the same temperature for as long as possible, which would be annoying in another food but is appealing here. He tops it with a drizzle of honey given by a beekeeper who believed the bees favored him. Heimdall did not correct the beekeeper, because being favored by bees is a nice thought to carry inside a coat. He sets the bowl aside and examines the horizon. The 4 islands blink awake. The bridge adjusts its posture. He switches the horn's cover to one better suited to daylight. A new page in the logbook waits, patient and cheerful. He writes, "Morning accurate." Watch continues. There's always the question people love to ask, the one about how he can bear the long sameness of the duty. Heimdall considers this and answers with the most honest word he owns, "Easily." Not because he is a machine, though he is sometimes compared to one in the way you might compare a dependable kettle to a more complicated contraption, but because sameness is not a problem when you understand how many shades it contains. He can tell 30 kinds of stillness just by how they feel against the skin. He can tell determined quiet from cooperative quiet. He knows the exact distance at which a breeze becomes a thought. He has heard grass practicing the idea of growing before it actually grows and has offered encouraging silence, which is more helpful than advice. He does not count time as hours. He counts it as opportunities to witness small competence. The world is full of it. A rope holding a boat chooses one more time to remain rope. A spoon remains loyal to its curve. A door meets its frame with dignity. He writes these down. The pages thicken. The horn remains silent. If a day comes when the horn must sound, he will do it, but his hands have learned to enjoy the tension of readiness so thoroughly that action seems somewhat theoretical, like a recipe you read for its pleasant order without planning to cook. He knows the first breath he will take the exact angle his elbow will find, and the fraction of a heartbeat during which the horn will consider whether it prefers to continue being a sleeping instrument rather than an awake one. All that can be prepared without drama has been prepared. Until then, he stands where light meets stone and listens to harmless secrets. The sheep confess that they prefer the left side of the meadow for reasons that cannot be put into words. The wind admits that it likes climbing steps. The sea pretends not to know the shore, then recognizes it with an old friend's glance. Heimdall nods, takes another slow breath, and lets the bridge hum rise and fall through him like a lullaby well within its rights to last forever. If you are still hovering at the edge of wakefulness, he suggests you borrow his way of counting. Notice a sound, let it be, notice another, let it be, and by the time you have let 3 or 4 be the bed will have made up its mind to keep you. If you have already slipped away, the watch will continue in that good, boring way it knows. Patient and clear, polishing the hours until they shine just enough for another quiet day to find itself. You might not expect the youth of gods to depend on a pantry with chalk labels, but that is the comfortable truth tucked into a quiet corner of Asgard, where Icon keeps her apples with the calm professionalism of someone who knows exactly how many baskets she owns and how many she prefers to keep empty. The room smells faintly of cool wood and clean straw. On the left is a shelf for today's fruit, on the right a shelf for tomorrow's, and in between a narrow table where a small knife naps beside a spool of twine. Light falls through a square window that likes afternoons best, and dusk performs its slow, dignified dance with the door closed. Icon moves like a good librarian of ripeness. She checks the bloom on his skin, the weight in her palm, the beautiful, uninteresting thud when an apple settles into its own shape. Each basket carries a chalk mark, early red, late gold, steady green, and the slightly mysterious winter kind that looks asleep but isn't. She notes which ones lean toward sweetness, which toward crispness, which behave like reliable friends who show up early and leave at a reasonable hour. The gods joke that immortality smells like apples, and the apples, if they could speak, would reply that immortality smells like proper storage. Icon agrees with both sides while tidying a thread on the twine. If you feel a small affection for this methodical scene, you could very gently give it a sign of approval later if you are still awake. If you drift off before then, the inventory will accept your absence as an endorsement of rest and mark it down under successful quiet. She counts in a rhythm learned from trees rather than clocks. 1 for color, 1 for skin, 1 for stem, and a 4th silent one that listens to how the room feels about the weather. She has a ledger, but is not a tyrant. It simply enjoys being helpful. In the ledger, each batch receives a note that sounds like a neighborly message. Decent blush, small dot near base, pairs well with morning. She keeps a bowl of odd ones, the 2 small, the 2 flat, the one with a harmless freckle shaped like a fish. They are not punished, only reassigned to snacks and experiments. Sometimes she turns an apple 3 times and decides it wants to mature next to a particular friend. Apples, like people, behave a little better when they know who they're beside on the shelf. Every now and then a god appears at the door with that polite, hopeful look you see on someone who has come to borrow sugar and would accept a conversation instead. Icon gestures to the bench and pours a small cup of warm water infused with dried apple peel, which tastes like reassurance and a hint of sun. They ask whether the apples are magical or simply excellent. She answers with a smile that manages to be both. The magic, she explains, is steady and not very talkative. The excellence requires daily patience, which is also a kind of magic that anyone can practice, provided they enjoy polishing barrels and listening to wooden lids settle. She has a habit of soft humming that sounds like the orchard in Distant Miniature. Even the knives in this room understand that their job is not drama but maintenance. They shine politely and do not try to be exciting. If you walk with her slowly to the orchard beyond the pantry, you find a sensible assembly of trees that could never be accused of showing off. They stand with their roots deep and their branches arranged like confident handwriting. Icon knows them by their quiet talents. That one near the fence can hold fruit for a wind without complaint. This narrow one by the path studies sunlight, moves its leaves by increments, and ends the day pleased. She greets them by touching bark with the back of her fingers, the tree version of a handshake that does not overcompensate. During spring, she carries a little brush made of goat hair to assist the bees when weather gets opinionated. She does not command the bees. She simply offers helpful reminders about where the blossoms are currently practicing being blossoms. The hives at the far end whisper about nectar in a tone of gossip that never turns unkind. On warm days, the orchard sounds like 1,000 soft errands being completed on time. On cool days, the trees wear a disciplined stillness and look like they are remembering something from a good winter years ago. Icon grafts carefully, and when people ask why she ties the graft with a strip of fabric that once belonged to a shirt, she explains that trees appreciate a bandage that remembers how to be worn. She waters with a slow, confident pour that would bore an impatient person. The ground takes what it needs and stores the rest as a plan. If a leaf curls slightly at the edge, she nudges a tiny change to shade and returns the next morning as if picking up a sentence where it left off. The orchard contains odd details that please her. A small flat stone that always sits warmer than its neighbors. A fence post that holds a nail so politely you forget it is a nail. A gate hinge that learned to swing without squeaking as though it had received instruction in manners. The gods arrange their visits like responsible customers of a well-loved bakery. They do not crowd the door, at least not anymore. Icon set up a sign-up slate to keep the mood unhurried. Morning refreshers, afternoon studies, evening top-ups for those who enjoy appreciating sunsets while aging in reverse at a reasonable pace. Odin, who can recognize good systems, pretends that he had always intended to come during his assigned window. He carries an expression that says the order of the cosmos starts here and the chalk supports it. Thor arrives with excellent politeness and a tremendous appetite, which she meets with thicker slices served on a plate that forgives enthusiasm. Frigg thanks the trees according to a household ceremony she invented that includes brief praise of baskets. Freyr enjoys the orchard simply for being an orchard, which Icon respects. He once complimented a trellis and meant it. Loki sometimes shows up with a story about a place where fruit tried to be clever and ended up being jam. She nods, cuts a small wedge, and observes that jam is what fruit becomes when it chooses a crowded career. These visits are not about drama. They are about maintenance of ordinary miracles, which is to say, everyone leaving the room feeling the way fresh linen smells. If you are still awake, this is a fine place to relax the face and consider the modern convenience of reminders. If you fall asleep before that thought is finished, you will have achieved the orchard's favorite outcome, and the trees will nod in the wind with professional pride. Inside again, the work travels at the soft velocity of bread rising. Icon keeps a bowl of clean water on the table for washing fruit, though most arrive from the tree already immaculate. She dries them with cloths that hold the memory of summer breezes even in late winter. She taps the tops of each barrel to check the note. A good barrel rings like a low, contented bell. The shelves are measured so that a hand can slide naturally between baskets without brushing against neighbors. Because bruises teach bad habits, she keeps seeds as a separate happiness. Their envelopes are labeled with a careful hand and a small drawing of the parent tree done in pencil that does not insist. Each envelope receives a sentence about personality, enjoys wind, dislikes hurry, friendly with bees. On long evenings, she tells the seeds the names of the months in order, as if introducing them to the calendar they will someday move through. She reads weather the way a baker reads dough. Barometric pressure is the yeast of the sky, she says in a voice that assumes everyone already understands. If she rises at night to look in on a particular batch, it is not fretfulness but curiosity. The apples gleam in the moonlight, quietly proud to be themselves. In a corner, a ladder leans against the wall as if it were practicing patience. She oils the ladder's joints because every tool deserves tender neutrality. When asked what neutrality means to a ladder, she answers that it means a rung considers every boot equal. She makes small preparations that look like gentle magic hiding inside ordinary tasks. A piece of linen scented with thyme waits beneath a lid for a basket that has decided to express opinions about humidity. A line of pebbles along the window ledge marks the height of last summer's light. Another line below, it guesses the height of the next. A slender wooden spoon lies near the ledger, not for stirring, but for pushing a stubborn thought to the edge of the page where it will behave. Sometimes she ties a tiny ribbon around a stem and notes, this one for courage that looks like good sleep. When a god receives such an apple, they rarely notice the ribbon until later, at which point they feel unreasonably pleased about the texture of their morning and give credit to weather, which is fine with her. She keeps a jar of apple vinegar for polishing handles and for medicinal purposes that amount to reminding elbows to be civil. She brews an apple peel tea that tastes like afternoon and a little like the story of how baskets came to be baskets. Visitors often attempt to be useful by rearranging something. She thanks them kindly and rearranges it back the next day, writing in the margin, "Helpful hands have opinions." The pantry sighs when evening cools the shelves. The sigh is not dramatic. It is the sound of wood remembering it is good at being wood. People sometimes whisper about the famous problem of the apples being taken away long ago, but Icon treats the rumor like a jar she keeps at the back of a high shelf. Not ignored, simply settled. The lesson it contains is not about panic. It is about how much of youth is housekeeping. She learned to keep extra baskets in different rooms, not out of suspicion, but because she enjoys redundancy in the same way bridges enjoy having exactly the right number of pillars. She started writing instructions that any god could follow in a pinch, in case she stepped outside to look at the sky and stayed long enough to admire a cloud's ability to resemble itself from every angle. The instructions are soothing. Count to 7. Open the lower door first, choose apples with quiet shine. Carry as if your arms remember rowing. A person could follow them half asleep and succeed, which is precisely the point. Aging slows down in the presence of calm behavior. It does not enjoy hurrying. Even the roomers learn to speak softly here. Icon listens to them without letting them rearrange the shelves. The same way you listen to a breeze that claims it will turn into a storm and then politely does not. In the late season, when daylight shortens like a good poem, she practices the art of keeping things supple. She wraps certain branches with straw and smiles at the tree for having done its part. She tucks the hives in with windbreaks woven from last year's canes. She thanks the soil the way you thank someone who saved you a seat. The trees appreciate gratitude even when they pretend not to. The orchard learns to hold a stillness that feels like a nap rather than a verdict. On quiet afternoons, she sets a stool near a trunk and tells the bark about small events that went well. A basket repaired with 3 new reeds, a label rewritten neater than required, a god who remembered to wipe their hands before touching the fruit. She does not keep these events to herself because success multiplies when noticed politely. If you are awake enough to hear this, perhaps notice a small success of your own, the way your pillow found the right shape, or the way your breathing decided to be sensible without a meaning. If you sleep through this suggestion, the orchard understands and writes your name in the guest book under "Slept Soundly." Will return. When snow arrives, it does not come as a finality, but as a clean sheet that the orchard edits carefully. Icon moves from tree to pantry and back with the measured pace of someone who has considered the route and chosen to enjoy it. She checks the barrels as if they were contented animals, pats the lids, listens for the round, satisfied note. She opens the ledger to a page titled Simply Winter Practice. The items are cozy. Check drafts, great seeds. Warm the room by thinking about summer carefully, like warming a spoon with your hands. She slices an apple to share with the stove, and remarks that the scent of hot apple is a way of closing the day without giving the night any work to do. She feels no need to balance the world. She only balances a knife on a finger and puts it away with a click that says we know what we're redoing. Sometimes there is a visitor late in the evening, a god who thinks better with both hands around a warm cup. She gives them tea and a wedge and an unhurried silence, and they leave with the expression of someone whose worries have chosen a smaller font. The apple itself is a quiet machine. It stores sun, converts it into chewable patience, and offers it back without paperwork. Icon enjoys explaining this when nobody asked. She describes the skin as a polite boundary, the flesh as a pleasant meeting place, the core as a boardroom where seeds hold reasonable discussions about spring. She laughs the careful laugh of a person who thinks jokes should never move the furniture. If someone insists that apples are exciting, she says yes, from a tree's perspective. She tells a story about a particular variety she calls the considerate one. It never bruises, not because it is tough, but because it chooses gentle paths to the basket. It practically lowers itself. Another variety dreams of being a pear, and occasionally stands at a slant to show willingness. She keeps both, because the pantry is big enough for personalities. The gods sometimes ask for recommendations tailored to their schedules. For long meetings, she suggests steady green. For a day of hunting, crisp bread with a stripe. For administrative tasks, she recommends 2 thin slices at 11s, then a single contemplative slice at 3. Nobody complains about administrative tasks when accompanied by apple. The paper approves and attempts to look smarter. You might imagine a dramatic warning lingering in the air here, but there isn't one. The closest the pantry gets to tension is a drawer that sticks by tradition until it remembers the trick of sliding. Icon oils it and says, "See, we respected the custom and we respected the improvement." She believes in both. The room agrees by smelling slightly of beeswax, which is the scent of wood agreeing to be handsome. Somewhere a clock says 4 in a language that rooms understand. Somewhere outside, a branch releases a small load of frost with the sound of a deep, tiny sigh. She checks the window for the strip of cloud she likes to see heading west reliable weather's bookmark. She ties off a line of twine and writes in the ledger, "Supplies steady, spirits good." Tree sleeping responsibly. The sentence looks pleased with itself and sits down. She wipes the knife, folds the cloth, turns the chalk to keep its corners sharp, and sets the cup upside down so dust and destinies cannot collect inside it overnight. If you remain awake at this point, feel free to quietly admire the idea of a cupboard arranged so sensibly that standing near it makes you younger by suggesting better posture. If you have already fallen asleep, the ledger approves and closes without a click. Some evenings stretch longer than expected, as if the sun and the moon miscommunicated politely. Icon uses the extra time to copy a favorite recipe for cider that takes years to admit is finished. The instructions are charmingly dull. Wash the barrel as if it were your own thought. Add a little honey if the year deserves a treat. Ask the air to behave. She is not superstitious, she is thorough. Thoroughness is the cousin of luck in households that ferment. She writes little asides in the margins about patience. If impatience visits, offer it a stool and ask it to count bubbles. It will be too busy to interfere. Nearby on a low shelf sits a jar of dry peels, one from each season spring shy. Summer bright, autumn wise, winter brave. She thinks of sprinkling a pinch of each over the threshold on the first day of the new year, not because anything depends on it, but because thresholds enjoy attention. Night gathers in the shape of a soft cloak. The orchard settles into profiles. The pantry cools to a polite hush. Icon stands for a moment perfectly still, the way trees teach when they are pleased with your listening. She considers placing a single apple on the windowsill for the moon, then leaves it in the bowl where it can keep its friends company. Apples like company. That is a fact supported by centuries of baskets. She closes the door and thinks she hears the room say thank you, which could be air moving, or could be the kind of comprehension you earn by practicing the same ordinary kindness in the same direction for a very long time. If you are still here with her, let your breathing line up with the imagined weight of an apple in your palm. Nothing heavy, nothing light, only correct. If sleep has claimed you, the pantry will continue its gentle work, and the orchard will lift your name with the next wind as if it were a time-tested label that means ripening nicely. You might not expect the calmest place in Asgard to smell faintly of warm honey and clean linen, but that is how the doorway to Ayer's little clinic greets you, as if health were mostly a matter of tidy shelves and a kettle that knows when to stop singing. The room is not large, which helps it stay confident. A table occupies the middle like a polite island, and every jar on every wall seems to know its own name. There is a window that keeps its promises about light, and a stool that never wobbles because Ayer sanded one leg an imperceptible amount and then congratulated it for cooperating. People speak of her as a goddess of healing, but the word goddess arrives in here and decides to put on an apron. She is the kind of patient presence that makes a bruise reconsider its career path. If you listen, you can hear the small click of her pestle tapping the rim of a bowl, and the slower sound of pages turning in a notebook that does not hurry. It is a soothing place to be mildly unwell, or to remember an old ache and then politely set it down. If you remain awake for the next few minutes and find your breathing lining up with the rhythm of mortar and pestle, you are welcome to nod in favor of the arrangement. If you drift off, Ayer will mark your nap as evidence that the room is working, and she will be quietly pleased with her broom for having kept the corners respectful. The first thing she does each morning is count the breaths of the clinic before anyone else breathes in it. This sounds silly until you try it. 1 breath for the shelves, 1 for the floor, 1 for the window latch that prefers autumn, and 1 for the water bucket, which has opinions about ladles. She does this not because the room needs it, but because rooms behave better when they are greeted. The kettle receives a measured amount of water, the kind a sensible river would be proud to part with. The fire receives 3 pieces of wood and no more, because generosity is not the same as excess. While the water thinks about heat, Ayer checks her jars in a sequence that never changes. Marigold, yarrow, willow bark, plantain, thyme, comfrey, and the unglamorous salve that fixes everything by refusing to advertise. She runs a fingertip around each lid as if the jar might have a story about the night, and sometimes it does. Bits of pollen like to hold little meetings on the edges, and she dismisses them kindly with a cloth. The clinic owns a collection of bandages that lie in the drawer like obedient scrolls. She rolls them and re-rolls them until each one reaches its preferred amount of roundness. There is a copper bowl for washing hands that catches the morning light and turns it into the color of approval. The bowl remembers every hand that has hovered above it, and it reflects them evenly, which is all any of us can ask of a bowl. Her garden sits just outside, organized the way clouds organize themselves when they feel competent. Paths curve gently because straight lines make plants nervous, and nervous plants spend too much time thinking about roots. Ayer kneels with that comfortable care people use when talking to babies or books. She knows which leaves enjoy being pinched awake and which prefer encouragement by compliment. The thyme patch likes to be addressed formally. The sage enjoys gossip about the weather. The mint appreciates boundaries and a pot with integrity. She carries a small basket not bigger than her hand because no plant should assume she is here to rearrange it. She harvests exactly what the day wants, nothing more, which is why the garden agrees with her. Bees move in the air like punctuation, choosing commas over exclamation points. A spider strings a line between 2 stalks and keeps its web size properly, as if it had read the chapter in an invisible manual about considerate architecture. When Ayer finds a leaf changing its mind about color, she adds a polite scoop of compost that smells almost sweet, and tells the leaf that many good things change their minds before lunch. In the corner, a flat stone stays warm after the sun has left, and she sometimes sets a jar there to remind the salve inside that comfort can be stored. You could say that Ire has patience, but she thinks of them as appointments with reality. A dwarf arrives with a thumb that has discovered the limits of enthusiasm while carving a delicate hinge. Ire looks briefly, asks 3 questions about wood, and gives him a small pot with a green lid and a practical spoon. She tells him to apply it every time he decides to look at the moon, which is her quiet way of saying "at night," and he nods as if she has shared a secret. A Valkyrie visits with a knot in one shoulder that believes it is a hill. Ire shows her a stretch that resembles a slow wing beat and asks her to count 8 heartbeats for the rising, 8 for the pause, 8 for the return. The knot loses its ambition and becomes a meadow. Even Odin has been known to step in on a day when wisdom has outgrown its storage container and needs a new shelf in the head. Ire suggests a nap conducted with 2 fingers resting over the eye that remains, not as a protection, but as a way of telling the brain, there will be fewer windows today. He emerges refreshed and suspicious that he has been helped by something ordinary. She confirms that suspicion and pours him hot water flavored with nothing except being hot. If you're still with us, perhaps take a sip of air as if it were tea and let it be warm all the way down. If you've drifted, the clinic approves, and the kettle will keep briefing the room with delicate whispers. In the middle of the day, when the light is a patient lemon color, Ire opens the drawer of instruments that prefer to be shy. A bone needle rests beside a spool of thread that learned humility from the Norns. A pair of scissors sits with its tips pointing toward the wall so it can look less opinionated. She oils each hinge, wipes each blade, and thanks them for continuing to be sharp without being unkind. Her ledger lies open to a page labeled "Nothing Important," which is where most of her useful notes live. The handwriting is even and surprisingly cheerful. Ragged cough responds to steam with time and a towel that remembers being a cloud. Sore knees prefer to be told stories about flat paths. Stings are convinced by onion more than by speeches. Between the entries she sketches leaves and once, for reasons unknown, a very small spoon with a halo. When asked, she says that any spoon that keeps its promises deserves celebration. A raven sometimes sits on the sill and attempts medical commentary. Ire nods in a way that keeps the bird proud and gives it a crumb of bread that tastes like approval. She does not dispense miracles like coins. She dispenses instructions that make miracles inevitable. Do this in the morning when the day is less complicated. Do this after you eat something that liked being a plant. Do this while counting quietly to 12, because 12 is the number that lets people keep track without thinking they're working. It is widely believed in Asgard that Ire can see threads of illness the way a weaver sees the direction in wool. She neither confirms nor denies this. What she notices, mostly, are patterns of behavior that politely invite discomfort, like shoes that host a party your foot never meant to attend. She has a particularly reliable lotion for hands that forget to stop being hands and become tools. It smells of spruce with a memory of sunlight, and it instructs the skin to adopt the grammar of bark. Gods and humans both respect bark. For headaches, she recommends several restful activities that feel suspiciously like ordinary kindness toward one. A sewn skull, step in the shade, close the eyes, remove the helmet of thoughts for 24 breaths, and allow the forehead to remember is not architecture. For stomachs, she keeps a tea that lists its ingredients with the modesty of herbs that win by persistence. Fennel, chamomile, a pinch of something mint-like that refuses to reveal its accent. She shows visitors the correct volume by having them pour until the sound of the stream changes from busy road to path through reeds. They always hear the moment. Even the impatient recognize that tone as the world agreeing with itself. Occasionally, someone brings her a problem in the shape of a long story. Ire listens as if the story were a skein of yarn, She is happy to untangle as long as it does not mind becoming a simple ball. She makes a gentle tidy loop here, a slip there, and soon the story can fit in a pocket. She does not say much during this process, but when she does speak, it is usually to suggest a task disguised as rest. Sweep the floor until the broom believes itself a musician. Shell barley very slowly with a rhythm that would make a drowsy songbird proud. Walk around the house until you have greeted each corner, and each corner has greeted you back. People go home and do these things and write later in little notes that their discomfort remembered how to behave. Ire pins the notes near the door. Not as trophies, but as weather vanes. Health, like weather, likes to be forecast with realistic optimism. There are very old rumors that Ire knows secret plants that sprout only at midsummer midnight, very small and very polite, that stop bleeding with a word and remove pain with a glance. If this is true, she treats it like a good coat kept for necessary days, not for showing. What she shows are the simple plants anybody could recognize if they paid attention. She likes the way plantain grows right beside the path, as if to say, I am here for the inconveniences of feet. She likes the way yarrow stands upright like a helpful clerk. She likes Comfrey's enthusiasm for mending, which must be guided like a child who wants to fix everything today. There's a jar labeled bruised butter that makes friends with every shade of purple, and another labeled distraction, which turns out to be small candy made from honey and lemon that convinces mouths to think about pleasant things while knees solve their own problems. Her favorite tool, if she has one, is a wooden spoon with a handle worn to the shape of her hand. She never stirs angrily. She stirs like the weather turning from wind to hush. Afternoons settle wide and slow. Light leans across the table and looks at the notebooks with interest. Ire sometimes sits and copies a recipe from memory with the patience of someone who appreciates ink. Dressing for small cuts, she writes. Clean with water that would happily be a lake. Do not negotiate with the cut. It will gladly stop being a door if you give it a roof. Her humor is even softer than her handwriting, but it is everywhere if you let your eyes walk. On a shelf lives a jar of pebbles collected from the river that asks few questions. She gives one to any visitor who needs to remember the feeling of roundness. The jar never empties because the river does not run out of answers. It simply continues answering, which is the river's version of generosity. Once a week, she polishes the little bell by the door, though no one is required to ring it. The bell enjoys being ready. Readiness is a form of health. As evening leans against the eaves, the clinic changes temperature by one small idea. The kettle whispers again. Ire tidies in a way that feels like a lullaby for objects. The bandages return to their drawer and exhale. The jars turn their labels forward as if preparing for a portrait they will not take. She sweeps in slow arcs that pick up the day and set it aside. If a late traveler knocks, she does not scold the hour. She treats time like another patient who has simply wandered in. She gives them what can be safely given at night, advice that does not require scissors, tinctures that do not argue with moonlight, reassurance that does not expire. On the windowsill, a small lamp hums at a volume the moths like. She cups the flame once with her palm and tells it, kindly, to remember to be flame and not ambition. Outside, the garden becomes a collection of shapes the night keeps for itself, and the path remembers feet in a very quiet way, like a dream remembering hands. People often insist on asking whether Ire has healed anything impossible. She smiles and says yes, several chairs. She prefers to talk about chairs that wobble, doors that rescue themselves from squeaks, and hearts that begin to keep better hours after learning a simpler rhythm. When pressed, she allows that sometimes a fever loses interest sooner than expected, and sometimes a wound behaves like a student who suddenly understands the assignment. But she will not allow the clinic to become a theater. She knows how much health thrives on boredom. She trusts boredom the way sailors trust knots. The spectacular is welcome to visit, but it must wipe its feet and leave before dinner. In this way, the clinic remains exactly itself, and illnesses grow drowsy and misplace their pens. On nights when the moon is bright enough to read by, Aya writes letters to nobody in particular. If you are tired, she writes, try washing your hands slowly. Hands remember the day. Water helps them forget. If your thoughts insist on running, she writes, give them a gentle task. Count the jars on a shelf you imagine perfectly. Name them with kindness. She folds the letters and places them in a box under the bed where dreams keep their spare keys. The next morning, she uses the paper to light the fire, which is her way of sending advice into the air without bothering anyone with envelopes. The clinic has one drawer for mysteries, the kind that look like ordinary things that refuse to stop being interesting. A stone with a hole through it that shows weather more accurately than curtains. A needle that will not rust, possibly because it likes its job. A dried flower that still smells faintly of honey after 3 winters because it cannot believe the season has changed. She does not label the drawer. She simply opens it now and then to confirm that wonder is stored safely, and then closes it so wonder can rest. Near that drawer lives a clay jar of salt for sore throats that asks to be dissolved slowly while thinking about rivers. She teaches the correct speed by dissolving a grain on her own tongue and letting the room watch the patients. Supper is not elaborate. Bread, a piece of cheese, a spoonful of something pickled, because pickles teach stomachs to make friends with time. She eats while reading a page of old notes rescued from earlier centuries, and she adds one modern observation in the margin. Hiccups persuaded by holding nose and swallowing from opposite side of cup. Patient felt clever. Cleverness may be part of cure. She enjoys cures that require only the rearrangement of how you hold a cup. The gods stop by in the doorway and say good night, the way people do when they have promised not to worry. Aya arranges everything for the morning as if the room were a person arriving to breakfast. Water ready, cups turned, a sprig of mint on the windowsill to remind the air to be pleasant. If you are still listening, you might try her favorite exercise for restless minds. Choose a part of your body that is not currently making a speech, perhaps the left ear, perhaps the space behind the knees, and pay it the compliment of attention without interrogation. Say to it, you are doing a good job of being left ear, or space behind knees, or whatever you have chosen. Wait for the sensation of the compliment being accepted. Move to another small region and repeat. It is as boring as it sounds and therefore deeply effective. If, while doing this, you wander into sleep, the compliment will finish itself without you. The body is competent at continuing a task politely begun. Before bed, she steps outside and thanks the garden for not insisting on drama. The stars behave like pins in a competent tailor's cushion. The air is a little cooler and tastes like a promise that the morning will know what to do. Aya closes the door with a click that has been measured to avoid waking the bench. She loosens her hair and tells it that hair does its best work while unattended. In the dark, the clinic seems smaller and even more certain. Jars rest, the kettle sleeps, the puzzle dreams of circles. Health hums at its low background pitch, the one you only notice when you stop searching for higher notes. There's no moral here, no twist, no dramatic conclusion. Only shelves that remember their labels, claws that dry themselves in neat folds, and a room that will awaken tomorrow to the exact work it enjoys. If you stay with it, the hum will carry you like a very slow boat. If you have already drifted, the boat will keep moving, and Aya will keep counting the breaths of the clinic, one for shelves, one for floor, one for window latch, one for the water bucket, and another for you, because even the sleeping deserve to be greeted. You might not expect the softest library in the 9 worlds to hum with water, but Skogvabekker, the hall where Saga keeps her memories, murmurs like a stream that has learned to read. The benches are polished by patience rather than sand, and the ceiling has the pale sheen of driftwood that decided to become architecture. The floor is a mosaic of river stones that have nothing to prove. Along the walls sit long shelves of low bowls and tall cups, all of them labeled with the kind of handwriting that looks confident from far away and affectionate up close. Saga is said to know stories the way trees know rings. She counts by listening. Each morning, a clear rill threads through the hall, arriving with the courtesy of a guest who wiped its feet at the door. The water runs beneath a plank with tiny windows, so it can look up at the room while it passes. When Saga lifts a ladle, the stream lifts a hush in return, and if you were sitting nearby, you would feel hydration as a form of etiquette. Odin visits often, not with a storm of questions, but like someone who has learned that wisdom is a beverage and the correct temperature is slightly warmer than speculation. If you are still hovering near wakefulness, you may approve of these arrangements in your own quiet way. If you drift, the stream will count you as one more successful listener and file the moment under flowing attendance. The first scene in this hall is always about cups because stories behave better when poured. Saga prefers vessels that do not show off. There are cups of clay with a grain that remembers hillsides, cups of polished horn that keep secrets even from their reflections, and cups of glass so calm they make water look as if it has decided to hold still purely out of respect. Each cup rests on a little square of woven rushes, because tables enjoy a buffer between themselves and history. Saga chooses the cup of the day by weight and mood. If the morning feels like pale light and low voices, she picks clay. If it feels like wind on distant sails, horn. If it feels like truth with breathable space around it, glass. Odin accepts whatever she hands him, the way a traveler accepts a blanket, grateful for its honesty. She warms the cups with rinses taken from a kettle that remembers the slowest boil. Then she pours from a tall pitcher shaped by a potter who must have preferred symmetry but tolerated charming mistakes. One side carries a thumbprint that has become the pitcher's opinion. The drink is not intoxicating unless you count calm as an agreeable dizziness. It tastes of water that has visited excellent stones and spent time thinking about vowels. Some days Saga adds a sliver of birch bark to the pitcher to teach the water how to pronounce clarity. Other days she lets it be itself. Odin inhales as if he has been reminded of the polite reason noses exist. Somewhere a small bell rings at the speed of dust, which is to say, you only hear it if you want. 2. Skogvakker keeps a stack of coasters carved with tiny runes that mean things like linger and meanwhile, and return to this idea after the bread. When a cup is set upon linger, stories learn the art of staying. When a cup sits upon meanwhile, a side path opens through a field of digression that is intentionally well kept. The bread rune is literal. A loaf rests under a cloth embroidered with little fish, whose tails form a patient pattern, and slices are offered whenever a sentence needs ballast. Odin tears his pieces carefully, as if performing a small map-making exercise with wheat. Saga spreads soft butter that tastes like meadows that never filed paperwork. They eat the way thoughtfully engineered devices hum, without drama, at a volume that makes the rest of the room feel competent. Cups invite conversation about small facts. And Saga collects small facts the way beaches collect shells no one minds stepping on. She knows how many times a raven blinks while deciding whether to share a piece of news. She knows which kind of pine knot brings out the richer color in a winter fire. She knows that most legends are 3 breaths too long and improve if you learn where to let them exhale. Odin adds his own trivia in a tone that pretends to be casual. He mentions that a certain mountain thinks slowly, even on windy days, and that the rune for gift turns out better when you carve it after dessert. He shares that the best time to knot a new cord is when rain remembers to fall straight. The room files these remarks in a place marked useful when trying to say, something true without waking the furniture. If you are still awake, you may add your own barely useful truth, perhaps the exact sound of a book. Closing when the page count ends in 7 and let it drift down the stream. If sleep has already arrived, your truth may register itself as warmth in a blanket. The hall will count that as a correct submission. The flow of the visit changes shape so softly you might call it the second scene without noticing the scene. Saga has a way of polishing memory with questions that do not pry. She asks Odin what the wind brought while it was on its way to somewhere else. He answers with a story that begins with the way horses breathe in cold air and continues with a village that keeps a ceramic cup at the crossroads for good luck. Travelers lift it with 2 fingers to feel its weight and then set it back, and somehow weather behaves for them. Saga listens with that bright attention that never interrupts. She rotates her cup by 1/3 of a turn to record approval. Her recording system is purely rotational. 3 turns equals remember forever. 2 save for winter, 1 share only with rivers. If a story earns all 3, she marks it under the edge of the table with a small notch that looks like a caterpillar napping. People rarely notice the notches, not because they are secret, but because they are not performing. Meanwhile, the stream under the plank window glows with the kind of contentment water feels when no one requires rapids. Skogva Becker owns a cupboard devoted entirely to pause. Inside are quiet games that do not try to win. A set of rune tiles cut from driftwood that has nothing to say and manages to say it elegantly. A bag of smooth pebbles meant for counting by touch rather than by ambition. 2 pairs of slippers woven from reeds, slightly damp in a friendly way, that make your feet feel like they have joined a well-run committee. Saga opens the cupboard when a tail behaves like an unruly necklace. She and Odin then spend a few breaths arranging tiles into small words, sometimes real, sometimes politely invented, until the necklace calms down and allows itself to be clasped. They do not call this method by a grand name. They call it reset, as one might reset a spoon upon a table after it tried to roll toward mischief. The stream approves by offering precisely 1 sparkle where the plank window meets the flow, an event that occurs on schedule every time they forget to look for it. ***. There is a tradition here of reading aloud plaques that have never been written. Saga will glance at a blank spot on the wall and announce, in the voice of a tour guide who loves her work, that the inscription describes a certain day when a certain king chose a smaller crown because it fit better behind his ears. Odin nods and adds that the accompanying illustration shows a pair of boots that have walked exactly enough miles. They are not mocking history. They are gently reminding it to keep room for the invisible author of good choices. Some afternoons, the game becomes embarrassingly specific. They describe the smell of the wax used on a shield that never cracked. They describe the left-handed stitch in a flag that made it curl correctly in a mild wind. Oddly, these invented plaques help real memory grow steadier. It is easier to recall brave deeds when the mind remembers where the comfortable boots were placed by the door. You may try this technique tomorrow by narrating to yourself the plaque honoring your favorite mug. It will not improve the mug, but it will improve the morning. The 3rd scene arrives the way a loaf decides to be bread, by simply becoming itself. Saga places a small chest on the table, the color of dusk seen through bark. Inside are folded cloths, each embroidered with a modest symbol. She pulls one that bears a pattern of little waves and lays it flat. This cloth remembers a certain fjord where people have the habit of greeting the tide by name. She asks Odin if he will try the cloth today. He agrees because the cloth has that patient authority only textiles earn. You place your hand upon the cloth and say a phrase, and the cloth lends you the rhythm of the fjord's news nothing urgent. Only reliable updates about kelp and gulls and boats deciding to cooperate. The cloth does not tell futures. It helps you arrange the past into shelves that support the present, which is all the future usually needs. Odin rests his hand, and for a while the hall feels like a harbor that knows the difference between leaving and arriving as merely verbs of motion. Another cloth bears the stitched outline of a hill where sheep once resolved a dispute over clover by simultaneous chewing. That cloth encouraged disagreements to become meals. A third shows a long road with tiny dots that might be boots. It suggests counting steps by smiles rather than by miles. Saga uses the right cloth at the right time, the way a cook knows which spoon will not mind the heat. Between cloths, there's bread again, because bread is memory that never brags. Saga cuts with a knife that recalls her grandmother's hand. Odin comments that the crumb is like snowfall that got the measurements correct. A small bowl of salt appears, and they sprinkle just enough to teach the tongue its alphabet. If you have ever salted soup with your fingers and felt briefly like a priest of flavor, you understand the rite. They drink again, and the stream beneath the floor races for 2 heartbeats, then settles, the aquatic version of applause. In a corner, a stool wobbles as if auditioning for a different life. Saga flips it over and presses one wedge under one leg with the calm authority of a mechanic who understands wood. The stool stops pretending and accepts its fate as a stable seat. In Skopabekr, even furniture learns humility gently. It is said that Saga and Odin drink gladly here every day, which, like many sayings, is both precise and an exaggeration. They drink gladly most days, and the days when they do not, they at least drink politely. There's gladness in small forms, a new cup that fits the hand like it studied your fingers, a story that ends on a word the tongue likes to lean on. Cough that decides to be soothed after 3 sips and a hum. Odin occasionally proposes a toast to the bit of the tale we forgot that we'll remember when it is useful. Saga raises her cup to the person who stored the extra blanket in the obvious place. These toasts have the power of spells, not because they force anything to happen, but because they remind the world of its own good habits. If you remain awake, you could toast something domestically noble. The spoon that never splashes, the hinge that retired from squeaking, and then let the toast evaporate into air without witnesses. If you are sleeping, your bed is lifting a tiny cup on your behalf. The 4th scene arrives as the hall's light deepens. Shadows practice being long without feeling important. Saga brings out a narrow book bound in seal brown leather. The book records summaries of long conversations in lines so succinct they feel like breadcrumbs for tomorrow. On goats and dignity, some overlap. On bridges and promises, same material if constructed well. On names for snow, useful until tea is served. She reads a line and waits the way a gardener waits to see whether a seed nods. Odin replies with a sentence that is technically an answer, but also a rest. They go on this way, not to finish anything, but to make it very comfortable for things to remain unfinished. The room grows expert at unresolved calm. If a gust rattles a door, it does so as a rehearsal for the concept of noise, not as an event. The stream repeats a simple loop under the plank window, returning to the same eddy every time with the contentment of a letter being filed. There is a quiet joke here about historians and leaks. The hall is called Sunken Bank, and people assume the walls must be damp with secrecy. They are not. The moisture is tidy, measured, and never dramatic. A thin line of moss runs under the sill like a soft underline drawn by a frog with artistic aspirations. Saga keeps a brush for the moss and combs it in the direction it prefers. Odin watches and remarks, in the driest voice available, that the brush is the true keeper of the lore. Everyone laughs the kind of laugh that warns no one and disturbs nothing. They replace the brush on its small peg, which wears the shape of the brush's handle from years of correct meetings. At the edge of the hall stands a shallow basin filled with flat stones, a map of islands that do not intend to move. Visitors are invited to select a stone and tilt it just slightly, listening to the sound it makes when water returns to its rim. Each stone has a different sound, like vowels taking turns. Odin knows one that sounds like the beginning of advice. Saga knows one that sounds like a blanket being shaken out. Your favorite might sound like a yawn deciding to be generous. The basin is not a divination device. It is a reminder that even in constancy, there are small shifts full of character, and that noticing them counts as art. When the world grows dark and listening turns easy, Saga and Odin carry the cups to the shelf and let them rest on their rush squares. They leave a little water in the bottom of each, a tradition meant for whoever tells stories to the cups at. Might the cups call it briefing? They smooth the cloth with the fjord and fold it so the stitches can sleep. They prop open the cupboard of paws so the slippers can air their opinions. Odin retrieves his spear from where it leaned, and it seems relieved to have been ignored. Weapons like holidays, too. They stand for a moment and consider the stream, whose surface holds a diffuse version of ceiling and faces, a watery contract to meet again without scheduling. Saga thanks the stream in a language of eye movements and the soft tilt of a pitcher. Odin adds a nod that translates into every tongue because respect is a universal preposition. He steps outside and the hall exhales, which is not fatigue, merely punctuation. If you have been listening this whole time, you may feel the edges of your thoughts wearing sweaters. That is Kavvaj's way. Stories put on comfortable clothes. Facts sit in chairs that fit. Memory lowers its voice because it has your attention and does not need to shout. If, on the other hand, you departed some paragraphs ago, the stream carried you out as carefully as it carries everything, delivering you to the mouth of sleep where the night remembers your name. Either way, the hall keeps humming. Saga will be here tomorrow with new cups that are old, with water that has learned new patience, with claws that remember the fjord and the hill and the road with dots like boots, and with a shelf of coasters that can make any table understand the words. Linger meanwhile. The bench by the door stays warm as if it believes sincerity has a temperature. Somewhere outside, the quietest raven tries a sentence and decides to save it for morning. In the pause before breath, the stream turns one last fold of light into silk, and if you were to look down through the little windows in the plank, you would see nothing dramatic, only a floor that listens, a water that speaks by agreeing, and two cups turned upside down so the dreams inside them do not escape before they are ready. You might not expect the quietest place in the 9 worlds to be a courtroom, yet the Hall of Gleipnir hums like a library that has learned to sit with questions until they yawn. The roof shines softly, not the boastful shine of a weapon, but the patient gleam of a spoon that has done good work and been washed. Pillars stand the color of warm wheat, and benches line the room with the sensible dignity of bread loaves cooling on a rack. Here Forseti listens, and listening is the main furniture. He is the sort of judge whose presence lowers shoulders. People arrive with voices sharpened by travel and leave speaking in lowercase. Even the air cooperates. It tastes faintly of clean wood and the inside of a good box. At the threshold rests a shallow basin filled with tiny smooth stones. Not for oaths, but for fingers dippers take one and roll it idly while they talk, as if the right verdict could be polished from worry. If you decide to remain awake for a little while, you may roll an imaginary stone of your own and show gentle approval with whatever button your modern world keeps for that purpose. If you drift off, Forseti will chalk your absence under case settled by sleep, which is an outcome the benches have always supported. Mornings in Gleipnir begin with measuring the room back into itself. A steward named Settle quietly walks the perimeter, straightening a mat by the width of a thumb, praising a beam that remembered not to creak in the night. He opens the door just enough for a polite column of air to enter and audition for the day. Forseti arrives without ceremony and sets his cloak on a peg that has learned his weight. He carries a small writing board that shows the scuffs of long usefulness, and he wears the expression of someone who knows most problems are knots that relax if you warm them. The bench cushions are turned, the jug is filled with water that has practiced calm, and the sand timer on the table made from 2 shells that once held the same sea receives a test flip to be sure time still knows how to fall. No one is rushed. Even the docket is written in a hand that likes margins. The first case is always scheduled for the moment when light climbs the second pillar, because that is when the hall remembers to glow evenly. If you listen closely, you can hear the walls taking attendance, pillar, bench, door, window, whisper, hush. The earliest visitors tend to be land and water. A farmer and a fisher appear together, their dispute so tidy you could stack it. The farmer's fence, it seems, has been very slightly enthusiastic, and a strong wind leans into the shoreline like a friendly shoulder, and the fisher's boat, not wanting to be rude, leans back. Forseti smiles because this is a classic, 2 good behaviors taking turns being inconvenient. He asks for the story from the ground's point of view, then from the tides, and the words settle into a shape that looks suspiciously like understanding. He traces a small rectangle on the board to represent the fence and draws a gentle arrow representing wind, then sketches a boat with a single dot for an eye so it looks attentive rather than guilty. He suggests moving the fence posts by the width of a palm and teaching the boat a new knot called polite anchor. The farmer nods because palms are measurable. The fisher nods because politeness is free. A clerk records the solution as if writing a recipe, move by 1 palm, not with 2 loops. Add patience to taste. Outside, the wind tries on a new direction and decides it fits. Inside, the sand timer remains upside down, not because time has stopped, but because it does not need to supervise .gl, ITNI, or keeps a shelf of oath stones, though they are not dramatic. Each has a name carved in tiny runes, not abrupt, even weight, levels, so people can choose a mood to hold while speaking. Forseti prefers oaths spoken into comfortable silence rather than flung across the room like javelins. A pair of neighbors stand before him now with a disagreement about shade. One's goat likes to nap under the other's tree. The tree does not object, but the shade has been accused of trespassing. Forseti invites the shade to testify by opening the window and watching where it goes. The shade, being a specialist, lies down precisely between them and suggests peace. Forseti proposes a schedule: mornings to the goat, afternoons to the roots, and the brief, noble window of noon to anyone who happens to be standing there. He writes it plainly. The goat yawns as if signing the decree. You might think this trivial, but Glitnir is built for the conservation of energy. Even a yawn can ratify law. Within the hall rests a long table whose surface remembers every case, not as grooves but as gloss, the way a playground slide remembers history as shine. Forseti lays out a quill that does not splutter, and a pot of ink that smells like clean rain on soil. He has a habit of arranging the quill parallel to the grain of the wood, as if good decisions travel more easily along straight fibers. He examines the edges of the table and finds, as always, a small scattering of chips left by rough belts or anxious fingertips, and he appreciates them. Judgment here prefers evidence of use. A pair of travelers come in with a harbor question, whose rope should be coiled first when paths cross on the pier. Forseti shows them how 2 ropes can share a peg if asked politely and if the loops alternate like conversation. The solution feels so sensible, the ropes begin coiling themselves in demonstration. The travelers bow in the modest style of people who suspect. They have been taught a larger lesson disguised as courtesy and go off planning to teach the pier. Sometimes a case arrives that has tried for years to be complicated and failed. A clan's boundary stone has standing ambitions, creeping a little uphill each spring to see more of the view. Forseti invites the stone indoors and sets it on a padded cushion, which instantly robs it of swagger. He asks the clan to bring their oldest map, which turns out to be a song. They sing it, and he listens for place names and pauses, the two kinds of geography that matter. He takes a stick of chalk and draws an idea on the floor, an extra stone placed not higher, not lower, but companionably beside the climber, as if the horizon had been given someone to talk to. The stone stops migrating the very next winter. It had not wanted altitude, merely company. The clan adds a verse about 2 stones and the relief of conversation. Everyone leaves carrying a small, round sense of rightness, the kind that fits a pocket without arguing. On a shelf by the window stands Glitnir's most reliable witness, a bowl of water. It reflects whatever stands above it and therefore knows everybody. When accounts diverge into he said and she said, Forseti asks the bowl whether it has a preference, and of course it does not. Water likes to keep both sides of a story equally wet. This gentle impartiality tends to calm people more effectively than speeches. A blacksmith and a tanner come to discuss the matter of smoke that drifts into smells, which is a class of disagreement language rarely prepares us for. Forseti sets the bowl between them and asks each to describe the other's work until the bowl fogs. By the time their breath has clouded the surface, they have used words that soften. The blacksmith appreciates the patience of hides. The tanner appreciates the honesty of fire. A new schedule emerges bellows before dawn, bats after, and they leave with a promise to exchange favors. A strap that will not bite a shoulder, a hinge that will never sulk. The bowl clears itself and resumes knowing everybody. Forseti's hull owns a drawer of tools that are not legal but function as if they were. A small hammer, not for striking, but for resting on paper to keep it from curling when decision takes a breath. A length of string that measures fair, which turns out to be the distance between 2 hands held without suspicion. A set of tiny weights shaped like owls that balance the scale as soon as they are bored. Today the owls are out because 2 brothers quarrel about a cart that claims to be both theirs and neither's, depending on who asks. Forseti listens until the verbs calm down, then places 1 owl on each side of the scale and a third in the middle, representing the cart's own opinion. The middle owl looks impressed by the idea of being consulted and sits up straighter. The scale steadies to level. Forseti proposes alternating ownership with a small ritual at each handover. The new week begins by oiling the axle and complimenting the wheels. The brothers agree because praise for wheels is a foundation on which anything sturdier can be built. At midday, light lands square upon the roof and spills into lines across the floor like cords laid out for inspection. Glitnir treats noon as the hall's nap. No cases, only maintenance. Siddle refreshes the water and dusts the oath stones with a feather that once belonged to a goose who had strong views on order. Forseti eats bread with cheese cut into shapes that look coincidentally like little laws triangles for clear points, crescents for exceptions that behave. He writes a note to himself about the difference between quiet and silence. Quiet, he observes, is silence with chairs. He copies this sentence into the margin where it can be found later by a mind that needs furniture. If you are still awake, this is a good time to let your jaw relax and your tongue settle like a bookmark. If you are asleep, Glitnir's benches will cradle your name as if it were part of the wood grain. In the afternoon, cases arrive like small weather. A shepherd wonders about names, whether 2 sheep can both be called Mist without confusing the valley. Forseti suggests personal signatures. 1 Mist wears a plaited bell cord, the other a dab of ochre on her forehead. Both remain Miss, which satisfies the principle of identity without overloading the meadow with syllables. A carpenter asks whether the order of boards matters during a repair if the door wishes to remain a door. Forseti says that doors appreciate choreography and recommends laying boards in the direction the door likes to open, a courtesy that prevents future arguments between hinges and time. A young skald requests judgment on how many metaphors a single line can safely carry. Forseti reaches into the drawer and retrieves the string that measures fair. He cuts a length and ties 2 knots, one for the necessary metaphor, one for the indulgent, leaving a tail for surprise. The skald looks relieved, as if words themselves have loosened their belts. Occasionally, a legal question enters disguised as friendship. 2 old companions wish to codify who buys bread on even days and who on odd, because their memories have begun to share pockets. Forseti draws a calendar that lists only the days it is pleasant to eat bread, which turns out to be all of them and marks a symbol beside every 3rd day for both buy. Then invite a 3rd. They laugh at this extravagance and accept it purely for the joy of occasionally surprising hunger. The clerk writes the arrangement with a nib that leaves little flourishes at the tails of letters. Even ink has moods, and today it prefers decorative certainty. A rumor persists that Forseti never raises voice. The rumor is accurate, though on one memorable day, he raised a spoon to illustrate leverage. He keeps the spoon in a special pocket of his robe next to a folded cloth, polishing logic. When debates tighten, he places the spoon on the table and leans a coin under its handle to show how a small nudge can shift a larger weight without strain. People remember spoons. Later, they catch themselves using less effort than habit demands and feel privately brilliant. The spoon has settled more arguments than oaths ever did. It could, if asked, testify to the power of humble tools and the persuasive strength of tea. The light grows warmer and the hall, sensing evening, adjusts its acoustics to favor conclusion without finality. A traveler from a far island requests guidance on the proper greeting for unknown doorways. Forseti suggests 2 knocks, a counting breath, and then 1 gentler knock, as if asking the wood how its day went. He demonstrates on the table, and the table, which is under no obligation to pretend, responds with a sound like approval. Another visitor wonders how to apologize to a path for walking it too fast. Forseti says paths accept pace adjustments and recommends returning the next day at half speed with pockets empty of urgency. He adds a brief bow to the horizon for good measure, which costs nothing and pleases the sky. The table hums again, possibly from pride in having hosted so much sanity. Sometimes Baldr's name passes through the room like sunlight through linen. Forseti, being his son, carries the fiber of gentleness as if it were woven into his sleeves. He does not parade softness. He uses it as a tool for weight distribution. When grief wanders in wearing legal clothes, he seats it near the window and gives it a task: count the number of birds visible between questions. Grief becomes better behaved when it counts. People leave thinking they have received a verdict, when what they have received is distribution of weight and a set of small instructions for carrying it. Siddle, who knows the hall's moods as one knows a friend's laugh, has a ritual near sundown. He walks to the pillars and touches each with the tips of his fingers, an audit of standing. He mends the line of mats with a straightening gesture that could be mistaken for hospitality and is. He draws the shades halfway, a compromise between the outside and the inside that both sides consider a win. Forseti signs the day's pages and stores them in a chest whose lock opens to the rhythm of common sense. The chest is heavy, gently so, like a promise you can actually keep. On its lid lies a sprig of something green today. Juniper, because Law enjoys being reminded that it lives in a world of plants. There's no gavel here, only a modest bow. It makes a sound with edges smoothed, the musical equivalent of a well-behaved blanket. When Forseti touches it, the note travels exactly far enough to let the door know that patience has served its shift. People rise without scraping their benches. They leave stones on the sill, small thank yous for the hall's willingness to hold questions without chewing on them. The clerk closes the ledger and tucks a feather between pages, not because it is a bookmark, but because feathers believe in return. You could almost think the room goes to sleep, and in a way it does, but really it stores the day like seed, exactly where tomorrow's hands will reach without looking. If you're still awake, you might try Forseti's favorite habit for persuading rest to cooperate. Imagine placing a tiny stone in each pocket of your thought, one labeled later, one labeled maybe, one labeled enough. Walk with them as slowly as hallways permit. When you sit, set the stones on the table in that order and see how the air uses the space they make. The mind is fond of tidy shelves. If you fell asleep halfway through that sentence, Glitner approves of your priorities. The benches consider you a precedent worth citing. Night holds the hall with the care of a bug closing around a ribbon. Outside, the path remembers the exact number of footsteps that left and rehearses them in case they return. The roof reflects stars in a way that reassures stars about their shininess. Siddle sweeps once, not because the floor requires it, but because the broom likes to feel included. Forseti hangs his cloak on the peg and says the simplest goodnight, the one that works in every language. See you when seeing is ready. He leaves the door not quite latched, so the first visitor of morning will feel trusted. The sand timer lies on its side like a small animal that has chosen to nap. The spoon sleeps in its pocket. The bowl keeps knowing everybody. The stones on the sill cool without ambition. Nothing concludes. The hall rests in that long, patient sentence that law and sleep share, a sentence that could go on forever and in this place kindly intends to. You might not expect to see God's favorite sound to be the quiet bump of a wooden boat against a well-behaved pier. Yet that is how Njerd likes to begin his mornings at Noton, with the tide exhaling gently and the planks answering in a tone that says everything is tied correctly. His boathouse is not grand. It smells of salt and clean tar and the kind of rope that has been explained its responsibilities and has agreed. Nets hang in deliberate curves, like lines from a calm poem. Oars rest on brackets that match their temperaments, the eager ones near the door, the reflective ones farther and where light slows down. Njerd moves through the place with sleeves rolled, a small brush tucked behind one ear, and the expression of a man who can predict the mood of wind by the way dust chooses where to sit. He keeps a ledger on a shelf at shoulder height, not because the sea requires paperwork, but because memory enjoys being escorted by ink. The first entry of the day is always a sentence about the color of the water, written with unnecessary care, pale pewter with a polite intention, faint green like glass that has decided not to be sharp. If you feel yourself softening already, you may approve of this domestic approach to divinity, and if you drift off while the sentence tries to decide whether pewter is the right word, Njerd will count your sleep as favorable weather and fold it into today's. Forecast. The door slides open on runners that have learned to be quiet. Njerd greets the boats by name, which are simple names. Low Wave, Slow Gull. North somebody because boats prefer names that behave in a storm. He checks the mooring knots with a touch that is both inspection and compliment. The Bolins answer like old friends. The clove hitches like polite cousins, and one shy sheep bend like a child who brought a shell to show. People call Njerd the god of ships and sea wind, which is true, though he privately thinks of himself as a superintendent of edges. Coasts are edges where two large truths meet and negotiate, and negotiation, he has found, is best handled by routine. He has a brush for the seams where planks speak to each other. He has a cloth for brass that must shine only enough to be proud, never enough to preen. He keeps a small jar of the special grease that knows how to persuade a stubborn orlog to stop narrating. Twice a week he oils the door latch because doors, like sailors, relax after kindness. There's a mug near the ledger that behaves as if it were full even when it is empty, and this illusion comforts him. Sometimes he fills it with barley tea that tastes like the color beige would taste if it remembered summer. Out on the slipway, the morning performs its little habits. Gulls hold a meeting about crumbs that have not yet materialized, maintaining minutes with the solemnity of municipal clerks. A slow wave folds itself over a slower wave and then changes its mind. At the end of the pier, a length of kelp practices faint waving in case anyone needs encouragement. Jared takes a narrow stick and draws a mark where the high tide remembered to reach during the night, a shallow notch in the post that will help him understand the day's ambition. He wears a belt with pockets for items that are not heroic a pencil, a spare thimble, 2 pebbles used to weigh a map corners when wind considers opinions. The pebbles are different sizes the way decisions are, and he is fond of both. He has a habit of tapping the pier 3 times with the side of his boot, not because of magic, but because it gives the pier a chance to offer advice. Today the advice is the creak that means the beam below wants a new wedge. He nods, writes wedge southern beam in the margin, and enjoys the feeling of having done something useful without making a scene. You could say that Nerd controls the wind, but he would prefer you said he hosts it. Hosting means watching for little cues. When wind comes from the west wearing that modest, brushed look, he knows to shorten the lines on the outermost mooring, so boats will lean into safety like people leaning into a friendly sentence. When it arrives from the north with a smell like cold iron, imagining itself as feathers, he ties the topsail of a small cutter with his softened version of a reef knot and murmurs, "You'll like this," which the sail invariably does. Sometimes the wind comes with nothing on its mind. Those days he takes it for a walk along the dunes and teaches it to draw snakes on sand, so the children will be impressed later and think the world is alive, which of course it is. He keeps a woven screen rolled above the boathouse windows to teach wind how to be polite when it enters. The screen is made from reeds that used to stand in a marsh and hear frog gossip. You can tell because it mutes the air with a frog-approved quality, something between a croak and a shrug. Mid-morning is for inventory, and inventory is for the mind what harbors are for boats. Jared reads labels aloud, very quietly, so the objects remember their names. He does not rush. Coil of line, 30 fathoms, keeps secrets. Spare mast wedge, cut from the spruce that like to listen. Pitch brush, the one with the honest bristles. A bent nail cut for teaching, not for using. He flattens a chart with the 2 pebbles, the larger one at Skagerrak, the smaller near a small island that sometimes forgets whether it is an island or a suggestion. He draws a thin line from headland to headland and writes root if. Conversation stays calm. On the reverse side of the chart, he has sketched a loaf of bread and written, remember bread, because voyages move at the speed of lunches. If you are still awake, you may approve of charts that remember bread. If you are sleeping, the map will fold itself perfectly and wait out at the shoreline. A boy practices throwing a rope so it lands like a friendly snake on a dock coast. Jared demonstrates the light flick and the patient recoil, then steps back and enjoys the practice failure of a good student. He can smell the sand heating into the day's first opinion. A tide mark winks. Far out, a whale yawns in the manner of a god doing an impression of a whale. Jared is attentive but not impressed. Fishermen would never get their nets mended if the sea tried to be spectacular all the time. He prefers the ordinary miracles, a floating plank aligning itself exactly with the current, a ripple pausing to frown at the sky, a scale on a fish catching sunlight just long enough to praise the idea of silver dot by late morning. He chooses a small boat for inspection, a steady skiff with oars shaped like reasonable arguments. He pulls it onto the sleepers with the quiet he saves for lifting sleeping children out of the sun. Working a cloth into the grain, he reads the hull by touch. Here, the scrape of a curious rock, There, the gentle dent of a friendly collision with a jetty that had things on its mind. He mends what needs mending, not because imperfection is troubling, but because fixing is a way of speaking back to the sea in its favorite language action described softly. He likes the smell of pine pitch, even when it travels with him into the afternoon like an unassuming perfume. He keeps a small knife whose blade is shaped like honesty. It separates twine from knot without pride, a use he appreciates in people. He tells the skiff about tomorrow's weather as if it were a bedtime story. The skiff creaks twice and seems satisfied. The second scene begins without a seam, with lunch that tastes like patience. Jared sits on the low wall where ropes sunbathe and shares a slice of bread with the wind at eye level, which is to say, just above the pebbles. He uses a little wooden board that his daughter once carved to look like a quietly laughing fish. The fish is now quite scratched, and one suspect's still amused. He drips a line of honey along the bread, because sweetness helps decisions remain humble, and he sprinkles a pinch of salt from a tiny pouch, because salt tells the tongue where it lives. While he eats, he writes in the ledger, tide walking with an even gait, 3 gulls considering union, kelp behaving, 1 cloud shaped like an argument choosing to be a pillow. Somewhere the tide turns with the shyness of a person changing places in a crowded bench. He finishes the crust, wipes the knife, closes the ledger, and does a small thing he would never confess is a ritual. He taps the board twice to let the ocean know the bread has been documented. Visitors come in the afternoon with questions disguised as errands. A fisherman asks whether it is fair for tides to arrive late when plans have been made. Jared says tides are famously punctual in their own language and recommends planning in that language. He draws a diagram of moon, sun, and water and labels the lines invite, encourage, and accept, which the fisherman admits is surprisingly practical. A child presents a crab found in a pool and wonders whether the crab wants to be taught to wave. Jared suggests returning the crab gently and teaching the tide to wave instead, a task accomplished by standing on a rock and practicing 5 deliberate hand motions in time with the small cusps of water. The child does this with the gravity of a captain and reports improvement. An elderly woman brings a sail with a tear shaped like a careful smile. Jared shows her how to stitch using the palm pad with a thimble, not against it, and she teaches him in return the name of a weed that makes tea helpful for throats, and thus the harbor profits at both ends, which is the sort of trade the sea applauds by being quiet. Inside the boathouse, he keeps a small museum of perfectly ordinary objects, which is to say, treasures. There is a piece of driftwood that resembles a house that doesn't mind being a fish. There is a broken mast ring smoothed to bracelet friendliness. There is a short length of rope spliced to itself in a loop so neat it looks like a statement about eternity, although it is truly a statement about someone's willingness to try a splice 3 times until it disappears into its own logic. He has a glass float the color of distant ice with bubbles, trapped inside like punctuation that wasn't needed but refused to leave. Sometimes he places these items on the workbench in a row that means nothing at all and feels complete. He would explain this by saying that order is a kind of wind the mind can invite. He keeps, too, a notebook of shore recipes that are hardly recipes. For rest on a latch, vinegar and a patient rag. For a rope that remembers rain too eagerly, dry in the shade, speak kindly, coil when ready. For molds that take liberties, sunshine until they lose their legal counsel. For stubborn tar, butter, then soap, then a story about better behavior. He writes in a hand that leans rightwards as if walking. Between the lines, he sometimes draws small wavelets and then erases them, not out of regret, but because erasing can be satisfying. And satisfaction is an ingredient in most successful afternoons, that by mid-afternoon the wind warms and the tide lifts, itself with the modest confidence of a bench standing to be moved. Jared puts his skiff into the water with 2 quiet pushes. The skiff remembers being young and does not overshare. He rows along the flat water, oars dipping with that correct shush which boat lovers wish more conversations had. He counts the poles like a man counting sheep he has already tied safely. A distant seal rises to check whether humor is permitted and is reassured by the oar rhythm. He tests the harbor mouth where currents experiment with decisions. A thread here pulls east, another insists gently on west. He marks the spot in his mind with a note that feels like a pebble placed in a jacket pocket. He tells the water good job and means it. On the way back, he passes a fisherman's marker buoy that has adopted a slight tilt to appear interesting. He straightens it without scolding and says not today, and the buoy forgives the ambition. When he returns, a pair of twins are trying to lift a net wrongly, and the net is teaching them that fabric has opinions. Jared shows them the trick, gathered not by strength but by a line of weight. Except that knots are small councils, not soldiers. Find the square of the thing before you ask it to be a circle. They look up as if he has revealed a hidden door, which, in a way, he has. One offers him a crab claw, which he accepts gravely and stores in the museum, where it will become a teacher of geometry with the quiet authority of chitin. The third scene arrives as the shadows stretch into longer, cooler versions of themselves. Jared lights the boathouse lamps, which are simple glass shells with wicks that prefer a modest flame. He checks the log for the time of expected evening breeze and opens the windows appropriate to a breeze that values courtesy. His daughter once told him that wind is like a story that wants to be read aloud slowly. He has believed her ever since. He stands on the pier and watches the line between dark and less dark move across the water like a very large cat deciding which lap to choose. He measures the breeze with his palm. He is an expert at wind in hand and writes a single word in the margin of the ledger. Something like considerate, something like plausible. Far out, a line of small waves turns into a silver zipper the size of a village. The zipper closes deliberately, then opens again, then seems content to remain an idea. Visitors at this hour come with offerings from the day. A woman brings a jar of pickled herring made from a recipe that insists on sugar when no one is watching. She swaps it for a coil of line that has been hoping to go to sea. A man brings 3 feathers from a seabird that drop them respectfully. In exchange, he borrows the little plane that shades planks into obedience. A boy arrives to ask if the sea prefers greetings in the morning or evening. Jared says both, provided the greeting is the kind that would not startle a skittish cat. The boy practices on a stray cat and returns satisfied with standardized results. A breeze brings a smell like old snow. Remembering spring, and Jared thinks of his other life, the one with the hills of Vanaheim, where fields talk and rivers dream loops. There is a gentle joke in Asgard that he married land through Skagi and then kept old friendships with shorelines. He smiles at the thought and straightens the row of pegs holding spare life belts, because pegs appreciate order. A small spider builds a line from a beam to the handle of a bucket. He leaves it because the spider's sailing practice harms no one and teaches patience in a language of silk dot. He has a habit of mapping the evening with spoons. Inside, beside the ledger, a set of 4 plain wooden spoons rests in a tray, each dyed a different shade by happenstance, one dark from stirring tar, one pale from stirring milk, one golden with long acquaintance with fish stock, one with a faint green cast from too much contact with nettle soup. He winds them from left to right according to the breeze. Tar evening means work, milk evening means family, golden means visitors will ask for stories. Green means herbs want a word. Tonight is golden. He nods and prepares a short tale about a boat that learned to turn around without being told. A story with no lesson except that some boats are attentive. Night does not hurry, and neither does the 4th scene. Lamps breathe. Ropes adopt the slack that suits their bedtime. Jared copies a few notes from the day into a second book. The one that someday someone else will read when they want to feel the texture of calm. He writes not of storms or feats or fear, but of henge behavior and cloud handwriting, and the day humidity forgot itself and became tolerable at noon. He draws sometimes the outline of the harbor as a sleeping animal. Tonight the harbor is a dog with its nose under its own tail. He writes next to it, harbor decided to be self-sufficient. Praised it quietly. If you are still with him, this is a gentle place to set your breath on a slow track. If you've been gone for a while, the lamps will continue without audience dot at the very edge of night. He walks the pier one more time, a ritual so soft the pier might not notice. He checks the wedge under the southern beam, taps it with the hammer once until it says yes. He looks at the tide mark and says tomorrow out loud because the word likes the echo. The gulls are asleep on the posts, heads tucked as if reading their own wings. The wind has put its opinion in a jar for safekeeping. From somewhere inland the faintest scent of hay arrives, and he thinks of barns and sleep, and the way straw teaches bodies to settle. He hangs the oars on their brackets with the handles all pointing one way, because pointing one way pleases the eyes. He inverts the buckets so the night cannot store unapproved rain in them, and he leaves a single bucket upright to accept whatever the night considers a gift. In the ledger he writes one final line, boats comfortable, wind polite, sea thoughtful. People tell stories about Nedred's wealth, about ships and fish and the bright coins of trade, but the boathouse knows a simpler truth. Wealth is a pier that behaves, a rope that doesn't argue, a sound you can recognize in the dark as home. He sits on the step with his back to the door and allows a few minutes for the air to finish being air. He listens to his own breathing the way he listens to wind, to judge whether knots need changing. Everything feels in order, a phrase that works equally well here and in any hallway where the day wants to lie down. If you are still awake, he would recommend a small harbor practice. Choose a boat part of your body, the left shoulder, perhaps, and imagine tying a mooring line from that shoulder to a friendly post. Not tight, just enough to say stay if you like. Then choose the right knee and give it a soft fender to bump against, so it will not startle when dreams drift by. Perhaps coil the thought at the back of your head into a neat loop and hang it on its bracket, ready for morning. Leave one idea floating with a lantern. It will be there when you want it. This is how harbors sleep without needing permission. He stands, makes sure the lamp near the door is turned low, the universal signal for ship. You are on your own, and that is fine. He closes the door with a patient slide, side to side, letting the latch kiss the notch. Out on the water, the silver zipper returns and unzips further night. In the quiet after that little spectacle, the sea practices the bump that began the day, and the pier gives back the sound it has perfected over centuries. It is to Nerd the sound of correctness. He goes inside to a bed that thinks in tides. Tomorrow will bring new ropes and familiar wind, a wedge to check, a child eager to wave at the tide again, and a chart that still remembers bread. Nothing in this needs a conclusion. The boats breathe. The waves make their tiny promises against the stones. The ledger dries its ink. Somewhere a driftwood house dreams of being a fish again, or perhaps a fish dreams of being driftwood. Either echo is acceptable. The night carries these possibilities along the coast without spilling a drop, and the boathouse, steady and content, keeps count the only way that matters. One quiet bump, then another, then a longer pause while the world, very professionally, remains asleep. You might not expect the most restful job in Asgard to involve a heavy ring of keys, yet Fulla carries hers with the quiet assurance of someone who has learned that order is simply kindness with pockets. The keys are not grand. They are polished by use, each one a different weight so her hand can tell them apart in the dark, the way a baker distinguishes spoons by sound. In the early light, she walks the corridor outside Frigg's chambers, and the floor, pleased to see her, gives back the softest echo, like a cupboard agreeing. She stops at the linen room first and listens the way a gardener listens to soil. Women speak in folds, and today their conversation has the texture of clouds deciding which shape to practice. Fulla unlocks the door with the key that tastes faintly of cedar, and the room opens with the patience of a well-behaved book. Shelves are stacked from cool whites to thoughtful creams. If you were standing nearby, you might hear the soft punctuation of cloth settling after a night of keeping still. She checks labels written in a round hand, guest sheets that forgive lateness, travel blankets that smell faintly of pine, towels that dry with self-esteem. She smooths one corner because corners relax when praised, and then, in the friendliest whisper, asks the room if it slept. It always has. There is a loop on Fulla's belt for a small brush, another for a pencil, and a pouch that holds what looks like ordinary string but behaves like diplomacy. When a ribbon forgets its job, the string reminds it gently. She has a ledger that never scolds. The first entry every day is a sentence that sets the tone. Clouds hanging low, cupboards cooperative. She does not hurry because the shelves dislike being startled. She chooses a sachet filled with dried thyme and apple peel and tucks it between the stacks. Afterward, the room breathes like a well-made bed. People say Fulla keeps Frigg's possessions, which is true, and also keeps the silences in which decisions improve themselves, which is the part no song mentions. If you are still awake, this is a pleasant moment to relax your jaw as if you too were a linen cupboard unlatching. If you drift before the keys finish their gentle clink, Fulla will write beside the day's sentence, listen resting properly, and consider the note a success. Her morning includes shoes, because futures are more cooperative when your heels do not argue. She brings a tray to the vestibule where the shoes wait with the diplomatic stillness of animals at a vet. There are soft boots with winter stitched into their memory, sandals that suspect the existence of gardens, and a ceremonial pair that enjoys being admired and prefers short walks. Fulla keeps a tiny tin of balm that smells like tamed forests. With a clean cloth, she feeds each leather its portion of attention, rubbing in small circles that teach the day to move evenly. The salas earn a quiet inspection. If a stitch is thinking about retirement, she convinces it to continue one more season by promising to remember its name. She keeps a jar of pebbles gathered from the path outside. For a shoe that sits crooked, one pebble under the heel acts as philosophy. She marks a discreet dot inside each pair so she can return them to precisely the spot on the mat where they understand themselves best. The hall seems to lean into her rhythm. Somewhere a broom feels proud just for standing nearby. Keys lead her next to a little cedar chest no taller than 3 hands. The chest has a polite habit of exhaling when opened, and she opens it gently so its stories do not rush. This is where Frigg's small necessary things live. Pins that hold hair and confidence in equal measure, ribbons that remember which cloak they loved last winter, a thimble for mending thoughts. Fulla lifts each item with those careful fingertips used for turning thin pages. If a pin feels lost, she pairs it with another and tells them to keep each other entertained until evening. She has a shuffle she uses for ribbons, one hand breathing out while the other breathes in, and the ribbons, soothed, become the kind of ribbons hope to be. In the lid's underside, a scrap of paper waits for rotating proverbs. Today it says, "A small thing put away kindly is a large thing never lost." She smiles at the truth like a person finding an apricot in an otherwise sensible cupboard. If you are measuring your breaths, you might adopt the ribbon rhythm one hand out, one hand in, which is the ordinary miracle behind most tidy mornings dot all around. Full of the day arranges itself into polite scenes. She walks through the weaving room and tilts a window so the draft imagines it chose its own path. The looms are asleep in their upright way. A spool of flax seems to have rolled a thought closer to the shuttle. She rolls it back and commends the thought. A spindle lies where it fell after committing excellent work. She props it so gravity will not crumple the praise. She writes a note in the margin of her ledger, left in a good mood, which is the sort of meteorology that keeps castles calm. A bowl of berries sits on the table as if it were auditioning for a metaphor. Fulla eats one fruit, obeys her, and places a linen under the bowl so the table will not consider stains personal. She shakes a cloth out of the window the way clouds might shake themselves if their mothers visited. Somewhere distant, a raven repeats the word neat to itself and feels superior, which is standard for ravens. By mid-morning, errands begin, but in Fulla's world, an errand is only a conversation with space. She moves through the high corridor with the keys quieting themselves, past pillars that have learned to breathe in force. She stops at the household pantry to straighten the rows, not because they need straightening, but because straight rows reassure jars that their contents are believed. Lids receive a polite twist. A jar labeled coriander leans companionably against a jar labeled understanding. She approves the arrangement without making a remark. She refills a small jar of salt kept for emergencies that are not really emergencies, the kind where soup needs reminding that it is soup. She writes "salt brave again" on a scrap and tucks it under the jar, for objects enjoy compliments delivered secretly. A young servant arrives with a question about where to put a basket that looks like winter but contains summer. Fulla says near the doorway so both seasons can see it, and the servant nods as if given a poem. Without fanfare the second, softer turn of the day slips in, the way a hallway turns a corner and becomes more hallway. Fulla carries a wicker tray to the laundry yard, where water thinks in circles and linen learns humility. She chooses soap with a mind for the weather, the way some people choose hats. The washboard, which enjoys rhythm, hums faintly near her hands. She is not fast. She is correct, a better flavor of speed. She rinses until cloth sounds like rain stepping on stairs. She rings with a twist that leaves dignity behind. From a small pouch, she draws 3 clothespins favored for handkerchiefs because their grip is firm but reasonable. She pins the linen so sunlight can read them cleanly. Handkerchiefs begin to tell the wind about their travels. The wind listens like someone in a good chair. On the line, a sock says it cannot remember its partner's pattern. Fulla says it doesn't need to. Some partnerships are built on mutual warmth rather than style. She saves a drop from a shy blue bottle for the final rinse lavender, the fragrance that convinces time to walk slower, and the yard becomes the sort of place afternoon would gladly grow old in, back inside. People begin to knock in that apologetic way of people approaching competence. A messenger brings a packet of receipts, sealed with wax in the shape of a horse pretending to be a leaf. Fulla warms the edge of the wax gently, the way a person warms a sleepy hand, and the seal lifts without sulking. She reads the figures aloud in a voice that implies numbers are just well-behaved beads. She adds a note, 3 bundles broomcorn, 1 bundle patience, and ties the packet with narrow twine that refuses to tangle for her. A skald arrives with an emergency, an ink stain forming a continent across his cuff. She sets a shallow dish on the table and coaxes milk to do diplomacy. It rises to the stain like a lawyer with soft shoes. While they wait, she suggests he practice unimportant lines so the urgent ones do not become conceited. He recites a verse about a spoon that never splashes, and she applauds so quietly the verse blushes. When the stain decides to be reasonable, she presses the cloth between folded towels whose lives peak at absorbing. Disasters politely, even the air becomes pliant around Fulla. She touches a window latch and it behaves. She threads a drawstring through a tunic that had given up, and the string, once convinced, carries on with an air of having meant to all along. She keeps a box of buttons rescued from shirts that found new destinies as rags. The buttons sit sorted by temperament rather than size. Earnest buttons, decorative buttons, buttons that will hold forever if treated like shy dogs. When a garment needs a button, she auditions 3 and chooses the one that looks most prepared to listen. She sews with a small needle whose eye understands optimism. Her stitches neither hurry nor perform. They simply present strength with discretion. She knots on the inside where knots enjoy privacy and gives the thread a tiny nip that sounds like the period at the end of a good sentence. As noon slouches into afternoon, Fula performs the tour of corners. Corners collect ambitions, dust, and unexpressed intentions, and she likes to counsel them. She stands in a corner and breathes for the corner. The corner breathes back, relieved. She tilts a broom into that triangle the way a musician positions a bow, and the broom plays the small song every room hides. She finds, as always, a number of objects negotiating their existence where walls meet floors, a bead that believed in escape, a crumb that refused to attend breakfast fully, a thread that wandered from its weft. She cups them all in her palm and relocates them to the pocket of the day, labeled endearing. A spider nods approval and continues weeding a ladder for dust to climb down when it remembers manners. She waters the plant that minds the north window, an herb that smells like conversation just enough to encourage it to reuse the sunlight rather than hoard it. The third easing of the day begins at the writing desk near Frigg's chair, where Fula keeps letters in the calm arrangement that makes correspondence feel like a garden path rather than a siege. She opens the box with the key that looks like an exclamation point, trying to be discreet. The letters that need answers today have been sorted under a ribbon that believes in promptness. Those that can ripen for a day or two rest under a ribbon that believes in flavor. She sets out a fresh sheet of paper and dips a pen with a steady nib into an ink that smells faintly of rain on old stone. She writes in a tidy slope that gravitates toward fairness. When she pauses, the pen tilts its own shadow into a small compass. A petition requests extra candles for a feast. She calculates like a person counting spoons at a picnic, then adds 2 because generosity improves shadows. A note from a distant farm mentions geese confusing the river for a road. She writes back that roads are honored to be mistaken for rivers, and recommends a pinch of crushed rosemary under the geese's wings, because rosemary teaches maps. She seals the reply with wax that has learned to sit down properly and presses it with a seal that leaves the impression of a quiet braid. If you are still with her, you might picture that braid and let your thoughts settle as strands resting in a comb. If sleep has already borrowed you, the letters will watch over the rest of the words. People ask whether Fula gossips, since she knows where everything lives and how it likes to be addressed. She does not. She practices a related arc, temperature. When talk arrives too warm, she spreads it thin until it cools. When it shivers with speculation, she wraps it in facts like a child in a towel. She has a set of phrases that insulate opinion without insulting it. Perhaps the door felt overworked. We might be kinder to the weather. Let's put a saucer under that thought. In this way, rooms preserve their climates, and climate is morale and quiet clothing. A warrior stopped once to complain that his spear seemed to have lost enthusiasm. Fula placed it by the hearth for an hour, then returned it with a soft polishing and a ribbon as thin as a memory. The spear felt seen and resumed being spear. The warrior felt mildly foolish and resumed being almost gentle. There is a cupboard only she opens, because the cupboard opens best for her. Inside live the small reserves of last resort, a bottle of clear oil that persuades locks to forgive, a box of calm needles that never snap under pressure, a coil of blue thread so pleasing it heals the appearance of sleepless nights, a stack of blank cards cut to the size of apology. She uses them rarely, but their mere readiness solves many problems. She believes in keeping 2 extra of anything that prevents chaos, and 0 extra of anything that invites it. A principle that would make an excellent law if laws liked aprons. Sometimes she takes down the blue thread and draws it through her fingers without using it, a kindness to both thread and hands. If a day has been demanding, she writes on one of the cards a sentence no one will read, "Today behaved after all," and returns the card to the stack, which boosts the cupboard's morale. When the sun leans low, Fulla checks the guest chambers by walking as a guest would, counting steps, noting where the eye lands, listening for a hinge that has an opinion. She loosens one pillow and tightens another. She tucks a sprig of something aromatic into a place where it cannot startle. She sets a small glass of water exactly where a thirsty person will reach without lifting their head. She folds a blanket halfway down the bed, the international sign for safety, and the room exudes the invisible word, welcome in a grammar every spine can read. On the sill, she arranges 3 pebbles in a row that looks like a sentence. Perhaps it is. She wipes the lamp glass because lamps enjoy accuracy. She thanks the chair for being a chair. Chairs like compliments even more than kings do that. Evening requires a last circuit. The corridor cools into a well-behaved river. Fulla moves through it with the keys now quieter than her breathing. She closes the linen room and tucks the time sachet deeper, not for protection, but for the pleasure of completion. She checks the cedar chest and smooths the Proverbs scrap with a forefinger. She covers the shoe tray as if covering sleeping animals. She moves a curtain 2 fingers to the right because the moon enjoys recognition. In the hearth room, she sets a kettle near, not on the heat, so morning can begin without asking for favors. She writes the last line in her ledger, rooms aligned, corners at ease, small things finishing their smallness well. The sentence looks satisfied and declines further edits. Before bed, Fulla gives time to the window that faces west. This is where the sky rehearses weather for tomorrow. Clouds in Asgard are ambitious but teachable, and she has discovered they answer to household gestures. She takes a length of linen and folds it into a long strip, once for sun, once for shade, once for that polite rain that knows when to end. With each fold, the horizon seems to practice agreement. She lays the strip on the sill like a bookmark in the evening. She whispers a reminder to the wind that doors like to be knocked on, and that letters love to arrive unwrinkled. Down in the yard, a bucket remembers its responsibilities and does not collect unwanted sky. A cat reviews inventory and finds the supply of naps sufficient. The keys on her belt sigh like satisfied cutlery and become smaller against her hip. If you're awake, you might try Fulla's favorite trick for persuading sleep to meet the schedule. Choose one small place around you, a corner of the pillow, the fold at the sheet's edge, and tell it, with no great ceremony, that it is doing a good job. Then choose another small place and tell it the same. Continue until you forget where you started. If drowsiness arrives wearing slippers, let it in. If it knocks later, the kettle will still be warm. Fulla would approve either way and record the result with tidy handwriting in the great invisible ledger where days are. Judged by how kindly they were folded, the night in Asgard does not end so much as decide to keep you. Fulla hangs the keys on their peg and tells them they have behaved. Each key remembers the door it serves and dreams the appropriate hinge. The ledger closes with a small sound belongs to good paper. The cedar chest rests like a creature that knows it will be helpful again. The shoes relax into the idea of feet returning. The ribbons sleep in disciplined spirals. Somewhere far down the corridor, a broom adjusts its bristles and thinks about morning. Fulla unties her hair, which had been cooperating all day, and lets the weight of it teach her neck about relief. She lies down in a bed that has decided to cradle, not improve, and the room answers with the quiet it's been saving. Outside, the sky continues its folding practice, clouds turning themselves into tomorrow's gentle instructions. Nothing seeks a conclusion. The castle settles like a stack of well-made towels. The air keeps its cool linen scent. The world drifts into the drawer labeled end of day and closes without a click. And if you are already gone, all the better the keys. The cupboards, the corners, and the clouds will finish tiding the hours while you sleep. Then file them under done nicely, which is the only category Fulla ever needed.